I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. On this week's episode, Bill and I have a chance to talk with Scott Kennedy, the Trustee Chair in Chinese Economics at CSIS. Scott is a renowned expert, and we talk with him about the state of the Chinese economy, about what business leaders in Taiwan are considering, and the effects of U.S.-China policy before and after the upcoming election. All this and more on this week's Trade Guys.
Well, welcome, everybody. This is Trade Guy Bill here, along with Scott, and our special guest, as promised or threatened, depending on how you look at it, 2 weeks ago, is another Scott Kennedy, who is the Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS. He is, by all accounts, a leading authority on Chinese economic policy, U.S.-China commercial relationships. He's been traveling to China for 36 years, if you can believe that. He doesn't look old enough to have done that. He probably started when he was in kindergarten and has lost count of the number of trips. Author of many different articles, short and long, one or two of which we're going to be talking about. And before he came to CSIS, which was about 10 years ago, he was in academia. He was a professor at Indiana University, whose main claim to fame, as far as I'm concerned, is where they filmed Breaking Away. Did you ever race?
I've ridden a bike, but not ever that fast.
Good enough. Anyway, when he was there, he established the Research Center for Chinese Politics and Business and was the founding academic director of Indiana University's China office. He has his PhD from GW, his MA from the greatest international relations graduate school in the world, Johns Hopkins CSIS, and his BA from the University of Virginia. This is going to be a conversation, but we're going to start off with Scott leading off with a couple questions related to the Chinese economy.
Thanks, Bill. And Scott, we really appreciate you joining us. It's of interest to everybody in global trade when the world's largest trader starts to slow down. And the Chinese economy has clearly slowed from the path it has been on for maybe 20 years. But it's difficult to figure out exactly what's going on and why and what to expect in the future. So if you could characterize the current economic conditions in China, what has led to this situation of a slower growth, and what you expect for the near term and medium term.
Thank you so much for the question. And thank you both for having me on your podcast. I am one of your biggest fans, and this is a super achievement of mine just to be able to sit on the same podcast with you all. And this is really exciting. The Chinese economy, where is it going? I kind of sum it up, China's economy, as what I call a slow tech dragon, because it's got these different tensions within it, positive and negative. On a lot of those trips, I try to get out of Beijing and Shanghai and visit companies. And I've done so this year. Went to semiconductor fab, went to a battery company, saw the new SU7 that Xiaomi's put out, talked to AI firms. And China's coming up with some pretty cool tech. Some of these things are really neat. And compared to what I've seen in previous years, genuinely impressive, genuinely peer competitors of others at the leading edge in the way that they weren't. They've also got significant downsides. They've got great electric vehicles, but they're making way too many of them. They're making way too many robots, way too much of lots of things that's generating overcapacity that they're dumping and making folks upset about. In addition, they still have a giant real estate problem. Went and saw this one battery maker, super impressed. And when we went to a shopping mall nearby for coffee to catch up and sort of figure out what we had seen, looked right across the street. Beautiful, beautiful apartment complex, 25 high-story buildings, all empty. Multiplied by 200 Chinese cities, that's a big problem. Why does China have this complex challenge? It's partly the leadership strategy to emphasize state-owned enterprises and domestic tech pull in the reins. The pandemic, obviously, they've had a huge hangover from that, as well as now the geostrategic risks. This is not just U.S.-China government de-risking, other governments de-risking, companies are now de-risking. And so all of that has had an appreciable effect on sort of the physical dimensions of the Chinese economy, but even more important, psychological. So the level of confidence in China is lower than ever. And by foreign investors, institutional investors, equity investors also low. And so that has just created this sense of malaise in China that is hard to square with how physically impressive the place is, but expectations just have not been met and people are really, really worried. And that's something that I hadn't seen in, such a long time.
Well, it seems to me that China's economy became a modern economy in many aspects due to export-led growth. We discussed this a couple of weeks ago on this show, how that there are three superpowers in the trade world: the United States, China, and the European Union. And the one thing that contrasts China as different, in fundamentally different in some ways than Europe or the United States, is the share of domestic consumption of their total economy. And the U.S. consume about 60 to 70% of what they produce. China's still around 40%. Now, 40% made sense in 1993 when export-led growth was the way to success. The growth rates were around 10%. But it stayed low. Can you help our listeners understand why that is? In some ways, that low domestic consumption is directly related to excess capacity that is wreaking havoc around the rest of the trading system. So how should we think about this, and do we think it will persist?
This is a real conundrum for folks who watch China as well as Chinese policymakers. There's both an analytical and a real-life dimension to this. Part of the analytic problem is that China is a large trader when you count by geography, because a lot of products go through final assembly manufacturing in China and then hit the world market. But still, a significant portion of the value added comes from elsewhere. So China's place in global manufacturing and export and trade is definitely a lot higher than it used to be. But gross numbers that we see in trade figures, I think, still overstate the importance of trade to its overall economy. And actually, since 2008 or so, net exports have only been a marginal source of growth to the Chinese economy. It's really been investment, government investment, corporate investment, and then a gradual increase in domestic consumption. It is a real challenge for China to find new drivers of growth domestically and globally. And they have had challenge getting consumers willing to buy big ticket items and invest. Pandemic was the biggest rainy day ever. People had saved for that. Now you've got geopolitical risk. You've got sort of domestic political anxieties. You have folks, this big swath of folks retiring before now that weren't there before. China's population is shrinking. These are all huge challenges that are limiting growth. At the same time, it's the trajectory of China's economy has a monster effect on the rest of the world. So as Chinese buy less, the world exports less. The rest of the world grows less. And so one of the big challenges we have is getting Chinese policymakers to recognize and act on the fact that they need to manage that economy as well as possible, transition from investment-led growth to much more based on consumption, and particularly domestic consumption. Otherwise, you're going to see the kinds of trade tensions that we've got right now.
Historically, it seems that every time they slow down, their strategy is to try to export their way out of it. Is that what they're doing now?
The fun thing about China, again, is it's so hard to know exactly what's happening. My sense is that they have unintentionally arrived at the place where they have a lot of overcapacity, which they're putting on global markets because there's no domestic buyers. But Chinese policymakers at the central and local level have really powerful ability to pull levers that generate investment in whatever priority sectors the central government dictates. And they can get the banking system, the stock market, institutional investors, venture capital to all flood investment into that zone. But they have much weaker levers to control domestic consumption. And so it's not that they want there to be a lot of extra supply just sitting around with no one using it, but they're not good at figuring out how to balance that. And so I think they were hoping that EV demand would continue to rise. It's risen more than internal combustion engine vehicles, but nowhere near what they have. And so they're selling it elsewhere. And I think you've seen the same for a variety of other products like we used to see for steel and aluminum and glass and cement. And so that's an inherent weakness of China's political economy that the rest of the world gets to live with. I guess at the same time, I'm sure that leaders in China are basically will conclude, well, if we end up exporting extra stuff, then we'll just have a tussle with the rest of the world. We hope that they just will live with it. They bring some anti-dumping cases or things like that, we'll get by. But I don't think the original impetus is let's overproduce to flood the market to generate dominance. I think that's a unintended consequence of the political economy.
Well, we've talked about that in podcasts in the past. It just seems to me you've described what happens when capital is allocated by the state, either directly or by signaling. You get overinvestment in selected areas, inevitably. And if you have overinvestment, then you have overcapacity, then you have overproduction, and it has to go somewhere. And if it's not soaked up by domestic demand, then you have the current situation. One of the other things that I think is interesting that I think you guys have done some research on is the Chinese de-risking issue. There's been a lot of debate here about Americans, Western companies, but particularly American companies, de-risking, not necessarily leaving China, but by creating alternative supply chains elsewhere, not putting all their eggs in one basket. And I think you've done some research that suggests that Chinese companies are doing the same thing. And in that sense, are becoming slowly much more multinational companies like the Japanese and the Koreans have done in the past. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I guess the first thing I want to say, but as a little footnote to put a endpoint on that first part of the conversation about China's economy, is there is this debate in Washington and elsewhere about have we seen peak China? Is their share of global GDP only going to go down? Are they going to barely get off the mat and replicate the Japanese slow growth forever? And I would say that's certainly possible, but not a guarantee. I think a lot of the reason for a slowdown is bad policy. And if the Chinese leadership changed policy, if they were more market oriented, if they invested more in education and healthcare and social services, if they let private companies really invest where they ought to, if they let losers lose and get kicked out of the market, the economy would grow faster. It's never going to return to the halcyon days, but it would grow faster. People's expectations would go up. This pall that people feel right now would dissipate. But in any case, that's not in the cards in the immediate future. And right now, as a result of these risks, everybody is shifting. And certainly Chinese companies also recognize that consumption is low, that there are certain challenges that they cannot address and opportunities that are not in the China market. And so they're going abroad to other markets in Southeast Asia, India, Latin America. We actually just recently completed a report that'll come out soon about Chinese investment in the entire EV supply chain in Latin America, from rocks and minerals to batteries to EVs. And part of that is there is a big growing market in the rest of the world, in Latin America and the Caribbean, that they want to attract. Same thing that they're doing in Europe in EVs. Lots of factories going up. That also helps them get behind tariff walls that are going up as well. So as much as others are de-risking and moving and shifting, the Chinese are as well. And so what ends up happening is there's really not decoupling or de-risking from Chinese industry. The big loser here are Chinese workers. They're the ones that are losing out in this. And that's going to create other tensions in China, because as their unemployment goes up and youth unemployment is higher than ever, that's a big social political problem for the Chinese to deal with. So they got, real challenges that are snowballing as a consequence of their development policy choices, the relations with the rest of the world, that are then translating into these other types of behaviors.
Are we going to see them using Mexico as a platform for accessing the United States?
We could have a lot of beers to go back and forth on that. And I think after each round, we would end up at a different place. At the moment, having not had enough beer today, I would say that I think that that's an unlikely pathway to success to enter the American market for them. Certainly, Mexico is trying to attract a lot of investment, and there are Chinese companies going there. But folks in Washington and elsewhere are paying extremely close attention to what Chinese are doing around the world, particularly in Mexico. And I think there are folks just itching to plug any loopholes that they see being exploited, whether it's in automobiles or in telecom or anywhere in medical supplies or pharmaceuticals. And Chinese are aware of those potential holes being plugged, and that also restrains them. So, we don't see a lot of Chinese EVs on U.S. roads because they know, even though today you can invest in the U.S. and sell cars legally that are Chinese, down the road, it could be blocked. And so that uncertainty is constraining Chinese companies. And I think that will apply to what they do in Mexico. But of course, Washington will watch to double check.
Scott, you've talked about the importance of investment. And as I recall, the largest investor in China is Taiwan, has been in terms of both stocks and flows for some time now, which is an interesting fact. But you've recently, your program has done some survey research among Taiwanese business leaders. Could you tell our audience what you've learned and what's going on there in that relationship?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. The Taiwanese companies are super important to global supply chains, but people barely pay much attention to them. And so we decided to do some surveys. So we surveyed them in the summer of 2022, just before House Speaker Nancy Pelosi landed in Taipei, which generated a lot of heat. And we surveyed them again at the end of 2023, a year and a half after her trip, and things had calmed down, to gauge how Taiwanese companies are thinking about geostrategic risk, how they are adapting to geostrategic risk. And what we found are they are very anxious. And as a result of their anxiety, they are pursuing more collaboration with folks in the region in Southeast Asia and Japan. And they want more collaboration with Europe. And they want more arrangements between Taipei and Washington. But the big thing that they're doing is moving. Taiwanese companies are shifting a portion of their production out of China to elsewhere. So we asked them in 2022 if they're moving or thinking of moving some of their operations. And at that time, it was about 26% thought they were moving and 33% were considering moving some of their operations. By the end of 2023, the numbers had flipped. And a third of them were actually moving some of their operations, and a quarter were considering doing so, about the same number. And they're going primarily to Southeast Asia, but in 2023, a big increase in the proportion moving to India. Very few companies are moving to Europe or North America. So the anxieties Taiwanese companies are, obviously you've got TSMC in Arizona and other chip companies, and there's other investments that we'll see from Taiwanese companies. But the large share of these companies are moving elsewhere in the region.
Semiconductors are part of the story here. And Taiwan obviously has world leaders in semiconductors. But a lot of the investment was in assembly. And mainland China's comparative advantage was always in assembly at scale. Is this what's moving to Southeast Asia and India? Or is it a combination? How would you characterize the industries?
Yeah, so we're seeing a shift in a lot of different sectors, from those in finance to services to manufacturing. And some of that is in semiconductor-related manufacturing. There's other parts of the technology stack that are in laptops and cell phones and other areas where the Taiwanese are parts of the supply chain. Part of the reason that they are moving are just their own anxieties about potential for war in the Straits, their own worries about supply chain resilience, their worries about mistreatment or discrimination by Chinese authorities. But another factor is that the companies at the top of their supply chains are shifting, and those lead companies are asking others in the supply chains to shift as well. So Taiwanese typically sit in the middle space of these supply chains. And so you get companies like Apple, which are doing some diversification to India, to Vietnam. And what they're doing is they're telling their Taiwanese colleagues, hey, maybe you should shift some of what you're doing so you can help service us in other markets. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing happen by these Taiwanese companies. It's interesting that when you get over half of Taiwanese companies shifting, you still only have about 20% of American companies shifting some of their operations, only about 10% of European companies, about 10% of Japanese. So those Taiwanese companies are moving at a much higher proportion because of where they are in the supply chain. Also, they're smaller, they're more mobile, they're not focused on the in China, for China strategy. So it's really quite significant. And in some ways, they're the canary in the mine for looking at the reconfiguration of global supply chains in ways that we hadn't seen before.
Let's spend a few minutes on everybody's favorite topic right now, which is the election. We've got two candidates, one of whom has been outspoken about trade for a very long time and has a record on the subject, and the other one has not said very much about trade, either when she was in the Senate or during the campaign. I suspect she'll have to say more because it will continue to be an issue that Trump brings up. Can you say a little bit about the differences you see between the candidates or between the parties on how they approach China from an economic perspective? And what can we expect from a Harris administration and what can we expect from a Trump administration?
This is another topic that requires us to look into the crystal ball. If we're thinking about a potential Harris administration, the baseline case is steady as she goes, continuity with what the Biden administration has done with a strategy of invest, align, compete, significantly, around de-risking, concerns about the national security implications of connectivity to the Chinese economy in a variety of ways. That is the way that they've messaged during the campaign. But much will depend on who they appoint, what the U.S. economy looks like. I know that there are some folks in government that think the administration has not been ambitious enough on trade and economics while they've been very ambitious on security. And some think they need to go beyond IPEF and pursue more trade opening measures and try and attract more commercial support and also help American companies with their business abroad. But that's not the base case. It's not where I'd be putting all of my money, given the trajectory so far and the alignment of American domestic politics. I wouldn't say it's an impossibility. If President Trump returns for a second term, I think two things are interesting and different from what happened in the first term. And again, we're just trying to look ahead about what is more or less likely to happen. I do think what we're going to see is very quick movement toward ratcheting up of pressure, whether that's removal of MFN or, a baseline tariffs across the board of some high number, as well as efforts to weaken the dollar to promote American exports to balance trade, continued push on tech. And I think if all of those things go forward, China's interpretation of what the Trump administration will be different than last time. The first time, I think what they thought was the president was putting pressure on them to get a deal, to look like he was solving a major problem and could take credit for fixing this problem as the best deal maker in the world. And so they sent senior official Leo Hood to negotiate. They negotiated round and round, eventually came out with a deal in January of 2020 that probably from their perspective was pretty good because it didn't really have a lot of commitments that they had to meet. It looked serious on paper, but it wasn't. I think actually this time, their view would be the Trump administration is declaring economic war. They're not just playing around. They don't want a deal. And so that they would need to fight back. And there is no Leo He or someone like him in their government now. And so it's very possible that they could fight fire with fire. At the same time, look to peel allies from Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia away with extra goodies and see if they could isolate the Trump administration, hope the stock market takes a mega hit, and he yells uncle and gives up. I think that's another as likely as them going through the same circus that they went through last time.
Well, I can't envision him yelling uncle, but just sort of institutionally, but I'd love to think about that. It's fun imagining that. From a practical point of view, if he did one of the things that he said he's going to do, and he does tend to attempt to do what he says he's going to do, and put in a 60% across the board tariff on Chinese goods, what would happen? Would that stop all their exports? Would they retaliate? I mean, they already have a retaliatory tariffs from the last time on most of our stuff. Could they even retaliate effectively? I mean, would there be an economic impact? What difference would that make to us?
I think tariffs of that high level would have direct effect on the level of bilateral trade, which is, about $600 billion a year, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that would decline precipitously quite quickly. And there'd be significant losses from exporters and importers. And that would also drive up inflation. and have a whole variety of consequences. But I think in addition to that type of direct effect of a decline in trade, you're going to see financial markets wig out from that as well. And that's probably where the largest losses will come because, it's trillions and trillions that are in our stock and bond markets and others around the world. And if those drop by 5 or 10%, that is greater actually than the value of the trade going back and forth. And then we could see other types of consequences. The Chinese really held their powder during the first Trump administration. They did respond, as you said, with those retaliatory tariffs at the same level, but they never pulled any of the other triggers that they could have. They really did not restrict in any significant way the export of commodities. They didn't sell off U.S. bonds. They didn't arrest American CEOs. They didn't nationalize any American companies. They didn't kick out students. They didn't try to isolate the United States in any significant way by providing goodies to others. They didn't push really any significant way internationalization of the renminbi and a move away from SWIFT and things like that. They could try to do all those kinds of things. So that would be a way more volatile situation than we have before. And of course, they've got a big military and navy, and they can also raise anxieties about trade in the Taiwan Strait and all of those other things to wig people out and see if they can make a Trump administration cry uncle, even though it'd be hard to imagine that.
Just as an aside, one of the issues that I keep waiting to come up, which hasn't so far, at least as far as I can tell, is Trump says, we're going to have all this tariff revenue. And of course, the foreigners are going to pay, but that's a separate issue. Regardless of who pays, we're going to take in all this money that will allow him to promote further tax cuts for Americans. It seems to me that if you've got prohibitive tariffs, there's not going to be that much tariff revenue. It's kind of like an upside down Laffer curve. The higher the tariff, the less the revenue because you're stopping the trade. And if there is no trade, there's no tariff being paid. Or am I completely off base about that?
I think you're right on the money. I would never disagree with the trade guy.
You got it right, Bill. But what I'm remarking at is the notion of reaction to financial markets being dispositive. And that's a fundamental pressure on any administration. In fact, I was remembering a quip by James Carville at the end of the Clinton administration. Somebody asked him about what he'd learned in advising President Clinton. And he said, well, look, as a kid, I dreamed about maybe being a 300 hitter in the majors or being the Pope as being the coolest thing ever. Said, if I'm reincarnated today, I want to come back as the bond market.
Yes.
Because that's what really constrains what presidents can do. It was the music of the time. It's prescient now.
Well, it used to be that in that era, of course, S&P and Moody's and Fitch would dominate the world, and they would raise a credit rating or lower it and crush souls with that. And this is still not unimportant. I mean, it's important to recognize, and watching China, there's no defending a lot of what the Chinese are doing with their non-market economy practices, the dangers that some of what they're doing with civil military fusion, the Taiwan Strait and other things pose to national security over dependence on a single source for supplies. But I think the U.S. needs to be really careful in how they go about it. Just because China's doing really bad things, that doesn't justify every kind of response. It justifies smart responses. And I'm really hoping that whichever administration it will be will take lessons that we've gained over the last 6 or 7 years and figure out how to really smartly tackle some of these problems. That doesn't mean just simply being less punishing or less difficult, but it means being more targeted, more selective, carefully prioritizing, weighing costs and benefits and pros and cons, talking to what our allies and others are doing. I had the great fortune of spending all of August, not in Washington, D.C., but in Australia, talking to our Australian friends about how they view China and U.S.-China geostrategic tensions. And, they sell 30% or more of their iron ore and other commodities to China, and they export education, 160 plus thousand Chinese students there. But they're also worried about geostrategic global economic volatility. A lot of that comes from China's industrial policy machine and what we've already described. But they really want to figure out how to defend the rules-based order, not necessarily the WTO per se, but the basic rules of the game so that there's not a continued race to the bottom. And I think you'll find other allies around the world that also have those kinds of concerns, deeply worried about the Chinese, but also care about how we go about defending ourselves.
Maybe we need an art of the deal here somewhere.
It's funny. We've been involved in a variety of Track 2 discussions with our Chinese counterparts. Bill's participated in some of those. And we've talked about ways that we might go about addressing some of these issues. Sometimes folks put forward these sort of small, limited suggestions about confidence building measures. Other times we've talked about what a grand bargain might look like. Those grand bargains end up not sounding terribly realistic, but it's good to go through the exercise. The other thing that comes through from those conversations is that when each side's making proposals, oftentimes a proposal is about what will address the other side's concerns. Sometimes it's about what addresses one's own concerns. And sometimes it's about what addresses third parties' concerns. And what we found is that in the Americans and Chinese proposals to each other about how to deal with the global economy, they're typically addressing their own concerns and not the core concerns of the other side. So how can you get the Chinese to stand in our shoes and recognize that when we're talking about overcapacity of Chinese vehicles, we have our own auto sector and all of the supply chain that's connected to that we are not just going to watch disappear. And they also have a jobs problem and an economic development problem that we need to be aware of. And so getting each other to stand in each other's shoes and come up with proposals that honestly address the worries of the other, we're so far away from that right now. I do give credit to both sides to keeping up the conversation, and folks in Treasury and Commerce and other parts of the USG getting on airplanes or hosting the Chinese here. I think that's valuable. But boy, we have a lot of work to get from here to the goal of stabilizing ties in the global economy.
Just one final question, then I'll yield to Scott if he has one too. You mentioned in the beginning sort of demographic decline, population shrinkage, which is happening in a lot of places, including the United States. But it seems to be particularly acute in China. I think the data I remember is right now they're about 4 times our size. By the end of this century, they'll only be 2 times our size. They'll be down to 700, and they're very different estimates, but it's, in the 700 millions, which would put them at about half of where they are now. How do you think that's going to change the economic relationship over the long term?
Well, we used to think that an exploding population was bad, and then we decided it was potentially good if you could mobilize those workers. The declining population could be positive or negative depending on how they manage that population. As you move towards AI and other ways of work, they just raised the retirement age. They may be able to get more out of a smaller workforce than they otherwise would. So that's a possibility that they will be able to raise productivity, particularly from workers, which is still only about 15% of the productivity of American workers, through better education, workforce retraining, the use of technology in ways that they haven't applied it before. But I do think that they do have a genuine population shrinkage problem that they need to address. Chinese families have decided they don't want to have more kids. It's too expensive. The future is too uncertain. So the fertility rate now is about 1.2 children per woman, which is not at replacement levels. They have to find a way to persuade folks that there is a future for Chinese, that they can afford to raise their kids. That won't double the fertility rate. That's never going to, but it could go up some. I think they also have to think about immigration, inward immigration. We know about Chinese moving abroad, and we see more Chinese now at the southern border than we've seen almost ever before. But inward immigration, China could attract immigrants from many different parts of the world. But that is a political problem for China to deal with, a social problem for them to deal with. And that's the same kind of challenge that Japan has faced. And Japan has modestly adjusted their immigration rules, but nowhere near what they could. Immigration is the great, huge economic boon to the United States, which we have to protect and nurture. So they've got definite demographic challenges. And I think it really depends how they manage those with whatever population they have to see if they can make them as productive as possible.
Well, Scott, you've covered the waterfront here. We thank you so much for coming on the program. I've learned a lot listening to you. I know our audience will appreciate what you've had to say. And please come back. This was really helpful. And U.S.-China relations will not be unimportant at any time in the foreseeable future, at least not while Bill and I are still filling the airwaves.
Well, it's permanent employment for Scott. This is going to be a problem for 36 more years. So more power to you. And yes, it would be good to have you back. Maybe once the election is settled, we know what the next government looks like. We can come back and play another parlor game and speculate. We'll see. In any event, thank you very much.
Well, it's been an honor to participate in the podcast with you all. I will come back anytime that you all want. And yes, these issues aren't going away, but we should expect to be surprised. Having worked on China for 3+ decades, I'm always surprised about what comes next. And so look forward to talking to you in the future.
We'll continue to live in interesting times. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.